Okay, we are live on YouTube and we are recording. Make sure that that's right. Yep, we are. Perfect. Great. All right. Well, with that, I'd like to call this meeting of the Shelton Charter Revision Commission to order. As we say every time, we are operating under Governor Lamont's Emergency Executive Order 7B, allowing us to have a virtual meeting so long as we are recording it for posterity and are streaming it live on a platform, which for us is YouTube. And so with that, let's rise for the pledge. I pledge allegiance
to the flag
of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right. Well, first off, I hope everybody enjoyed the beautiful weekend. Second, I would encourage folks to mute unless you're going to be talking. That way the Zoom doesn't jump around to different people. We are in good shape heading into May. So as you probably saw from my email, we have gone through and disposed of either positively or negatively 28 ideas. We have 18 more to go. 8 of which we have enough information to act on tonight if we so choose, which leaves us with 10. And my hope is to have all the information to act on all of the ideas by next Monday, and also to have our first draft of the written word either next Monday or the Monday after that, depending on how far I get with it. So we're very quickly going to pivot from big ideas to devils in the details and looking at language. But for now, we're still at the big idea phase. So I have 8 to go through tonight. Anything anybody else wanted to talk about before we dove into it? All right, let me share my screen. And so, first idea for us to discuss is one that we didn't talk about. We talked a lot about the Board of Education last time, but wanted to talk about term lengths. And 3 groups we wanted to talk about: the Board of Education, our appointed boards, and planning and zoning. So we can talk about these together or separately. They all have slightly different implications. So with the Board of Education, what I can share with you guys is what other towns do, and then we could talk about whether we want to keep it 2 years or move it to 4, with obviously 4 being staggered, 5-4 being elected. So let me just share with you what other towns do. Hey there, Don.
Hey, Dan. You guys.
Hey, Don.
So other towns, if you look at the Board of Education, you can actually see that 4 is actually more the norm, but as with most things, they are all over the place. You'll see that a number of towns, including our neighbors in the valley, do 2. Some towns elect 3 every 3 years. Some do 6 years, like Easton. But you can see that the vast majority of them do have a 4-year term. But it's not exactly unanimous. The second most popular is 2, with a couple of them doing 3. So I think the question to us is, I think we all know the arguments here, right? Like the argument for a 2-year term is if you get somebody bad in there, you can get them out faster. It is much more democratic and responsive to voters. Whereas the argument for a 4-year term is one of expertise, is that you actually build up expertise, and things like the Board of Ed are complex, where you actually need someone who has learned the ropes, who is there, and you don't want everybody new at the same time. So there's arguments on both sides of this, and wanted to hear what you guys felt.
I will. Darlisa Ritter here.
Good place to start.
Okay, I think 2 years is a fine number. Even though you have to learn a lot, when you accept the position to run, you should start familiarizing yourself with past minutes and what's going on. I think that 2 years works out fine, because if you look at this year's board, we have 2 people returning, one from each major party. And so it's like they already got a 4-year term. Of course, both of them have been on multiple years. So I think, let the people have their say.
Great, thanks, Alyssa. Other thoughts?
I like the 4-year term.
Say more, Don.
I like people, I buy the argument of just acquiring a little knowledge and then being able to benefit from that knowledge that people accrue over a couple of years. But more than that, I like the idea of people being held accountable for their decisions. And in 2 years, it's too easy just to hit and run. Not that I think they have been particularly held accountable over time, but I think it's a good idea. I think in principle, it's the way to go.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I don't know if it's 4 years, maybe we could compromise and go 3, but I do think there's something to be said for continuity, for learned behavior or learned information over a period of time that sometimes can get lost if someone is all of a sudden voted out and somebody new comes in.
Darlisa again. Another thought I had is, because the times are so different, we're going to need to recreate our school system to adjust to the new way of learning. And I think 2 years, and let's get some new people in who are more tech savvy, who will be able to help us. If we keep the same people for 4 years right now, I think that would be a big hindrance. I think we need to have open minds and new thoughts. I think that 2 years now, perhaps we could put a limit on it, 2 years for maybe half of this charter's lifetime, and then change it, re-meet and see if we want to try that. I don't know how that works. So, but I do know right now, school systems around our nation are scurrying like crazy to get ideas from outside people. And maybe we do need new folks on the board every 2 years because of this time. Perhaps the next charter, no, we would want to retain the 4 years, or maybe in 5 years, we may want to go to 5 years. But right now, I think it's crucial to have those 2 years and get some other people on the board.
Other thoughts?
Well, I would think that it would have to either be a 2 or 4 year term, because a 3-year term, would that conflict with our 2-year election cycle?
That's the point. I'll jump in there, Ruth. I do agree with you on that one, even though I get Dave's point of a compromise between 2 and 4. The reason I don't like 3 is because now you have the Board of Ed running with the governor, running with the president. I like having all our municipal elections at the same time so people can really focus on what is right for our municipality rather than having to think about our state or our nation. They can really think local. So I like either 2 or 4. I'm not wild about 3.
I agree with you, Dan, on that.
What, Gare, where do you fall out on 2 versus 4?
I could be swayed either way. If we were to do a 4-year term, I guess we would have to phase it on the next election.
That's correct. You would, the way you would phase it in is you would have 5 slots be 4-year terms and 2 slots be or 4 slots be 2-year terms. That's how you phase something like that.
Or you would have each party put 3 members up for a 4-year term and 3 members up for a 2-year term.
Right, that's right.
And then the following election, you would have
Only half.
6 people up for a right. I mean, that's how it would work.
That's right. The transition almost becomes, in the next municipal election, in the 2021 election, there would be 2 elections to the Board of Ed for a 4-year term and a 2-year term.
And then the following election, then
It's all 4-year term.
it would be all 4-year term.
Correct. And only be half the board that is up. So that's how you transition it. Ruth Ann, what do you think?
Yes, and me as well could be swayed either way. I see the sides, both sides of it. My gut is to say that I go with the 4-year staggered, but I do see the point, you know, that you want somebody out, you vote them out after 2 years. But I do have a question. Are there term limits as how long somebody can be on the board?
There are
No.
not.
So something you get voted in, you just stay in, you could be on as forever, basically.
Yes.
So, I mean, is that a consideration if you, or not, or does that not ever come to play
Well, there's no term limits on any of our boards.
Right.
on any of our boards? Okay.
But very few towns have them. Some towns, there are some towns that do have term limits, but they tend to be actually on the appointed boards, not on the elected boards. I'm not sure if it's allowed on the elected boards under state statute.
Oh,
But with appointed boards, I've seen them say no more than 2 consecutive terms, but it's actually pretty rare in the charters I've seen.
oh, okay. Okay. I mean, some of our, you know, our national, you know, things have term limits that I'm surprised that we don't have term limits on things. I'm a firm believer of term limits for most things, but just saying. But I could go either way. My gut is 4 years. I mean, that's where I would go first, but I could be swayed either way.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So I'll give my opinion last, as always. Like, I also see the merit of both of these, and I see that other towns have mostly chosen 4. You know, I'm kind of like, I see both sides of the argument. I don't feel strong either way. I always tend to bias myself principle-wise towards being more democratic, small d. So I want to give people more chances to, I could say this having been one of the bums, throw the bums out, right? Like, so I want to give those people more opportunity. But I totally see the argument for a 4. Like 4 years is not an exorbitant amount of time, right? It's not a crazy long amount of time. So that's why if you force me to choose right now, I choose 2 years, but I could easily be swayed. So what I'm hearing is there's kind of, you know, I heard Darlissa passionate about 2 years. I heard Don passionate about 4 years, with the rest of us all kind of leaning one way or the other, but not, I heard most of us say we could be swayed.
My feeling is I think we should stay consistent, but I guess, you know, so if you want to talk about planning and zoning, and we're gonna, you know, if we're gonna go 4 years, then I could see the argument, you know, if with one commission or versus another.
Yeah. So there is a consistency issue. I agree with you here. So let's bounce a little bit. Let's bounce over to planning and zoning, where 8 or 10 years ago, whenever we did the last charter revision commission, I think it was 8, we changed this from a 2-year term to a 4-year term for planning and zoning stagger. And I think it was largely based off of what you're seeing in front of you, which is section 8.4A of state statutes, which basically says here in the highlighted area, you can have a separate planning and a separate zoning commission, like Stratford does. They have a separate elected planning commission that deals with the town plan, a separate zoning commission which deals with zoning and rezoning, different areas. If you want to combine the two, what state statute says is that you can have anywhere between 5 to 10 voting members. And if you have, this is the way I'm reading it, if you have a 5-member planning and zoning commissions, then the provisions of this other section apply. But if you have 6 or more members, the provision of the other section applies, except the terms of office have to be arranged so that not more than 3 of the 6, or in our case where we're going 4 of the 7, are expire in any 1 year, right? Basically saying that you have to have staggered terms, and therefore, unless you're going to have 1-year term, or, you know, unless you're going to have elections every year, right? You can have a 2-year term, but then you're electing everyone every year. You kind of have to go to a 4-year term. And Ruth Ann, you might remember this from last time. Was this the statute that everyone was looking at when they said, "Yep, we got to go to a 4-year term"? I don't know if you remember.
I think so. I don't know, Sophie, do you remember? But I kind of think so. I think that's where that came from.
That's not when it was changed, though. It wasn't changed in the
Right.
last charter revision.
When was it changed, Ruth?
It was changed around 2013, I believe.
I think that's the last charter revision.
That was the last charter.
Yes.
Oh, was
yeah,
it?
Yeah.
2012 was the last charter.
Yes.
So this is where, look, I'm not a lawyer, right? And so, but the language seems, in my non-legal opinion, to say that, yeah, you kind of have to have, it doesn't say 4-year terms. It says they can't all expire in the same year. So if you wanted to do a 2-year term, you'd have to elect 5 1 year and 4 the next year, and you'd have P and Z on the ballot every year. Do other people read it differently, or do we need to get a legal opinion on this, or what's?
I think, Dan, you gotta give me a second. I want to get a piece of paper on something I have in the room. Hold on.
Right.
Again, it's the wording of the state statute that says shall. It doesn't say
Right.
should. It says
Right.
shall.
Was that the motivation? Was that the motivation for keeping an alternate?
No.
No.
So let me ask folks this question. If this didn't exist, right? So Gary's getting a piece of paper. If this didn't exist, would we want to move this to 2 years? Or is the arguments the same as on the Board of Ed?
I think the argument is the
This is-
same as the Board of Ed.
I think so too.
You know, and I'll go back to my argument. I did have Jason check with OLR,
Yep.
and they did talk a little bit about that Supreme Court case. And basically, the way the woman read it, in the area of local concern, general statutory provisions must yield to the municipal charter provisions governing the same subject matter. Our constitutional home rule provision prohibits the legislature from encroaching on local authority to regulate matters of purely local concern. In contrast, matters that concern areas within preview of the state's police powers have traditionally been viewed as matter of statewide concern. And then in capital, ultimately, a matter is of local concern when it relates to concerns that are of particular importance to a town itself, or put differently, impacts only the municipality itself and does not affect the interests of the rest of the state. So the way and that's kind of what I've been told by a few lawyers who read that case, gives this charter the right to do what it wants, because I don't see whether it's a 2-year term or a 4-year term affect the rest of the state. It's what we feel affects Shelton. So I think that, you know, I'm really not too concerned, you know, about what that state statute says.
Our current charter does not stipulate that it needs to be that way. It does not mention anything. It just says that the no more than 4 members of whom shall be from the same political party does not
Right.
say anything about term.
But yeah, right. And our
So
state.
it was not changed at the last
Right.
revision.
And-
It was
and-
changed
and-
after.
The Supreme Court case came in 2018. Our charter was written in 2012.
So there's 2 questions here, right? There's the question of what do we want? And there's the question of what is allowed, right? Because the
Right.
question is, this first question is, hey, if we want to fight for a 2-year term, then okay, right? Like, I think this is and this again, I am not a lawyer, right? But I would imagine that if we went to a 2-year term, that this could go to court and it could be adjudicated, right? Could be, right? Like the stuff Gary is saying could be viable. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know. But I can certainly see that there are 2 sides to that issue about what section 8.4 says versus what Gary said. Those 2 things are in conflict.
It's not what I said. That's what I read by.
What OLR read, what OLR wrote, right? And so you could see this being a interesting case of home rule versus statute, right? Because the statute, as Ruth says shall. So I don't know. The question is, my first question is, if people feel passionate about, hey, planning and zoning should be 2 years, then yeah, I think we can wade into that murky water. I just don't know, based on the previous conversation, if people are going to be passionate about saying we want P&Z to be 2 years. What do you guys think?
And my feeling is, if I would like to see us stay consistent.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying if it's 4 years P&Z, you want 4 years Board of Ed?
Then I'd be more likely to say 4 years
Right.
Board of Ed. Right.
And that's the question. I think the question begs, what are we trying to fix?
Right.
Yeah.
Darlisa here again. I had another thought about the Board of Ed. If we're going from 5 to 4 to 6 to 3, then shouldn't we let the voting public acclimate to this change before we extend the terms to 4 years? Because that's going to be confusing. We had a lot of confusion last election with the Board of Ed. Now we're putting on 2 major changes. I think one change at a time.
I think that could be done on the ballot, where you would have under the people's name, these people are for a 4-year term, and then you would have it on another line, these people for a 2-year term.
2-year term, yeah.
And we've had that in the past. I mean, you know, because you know, the question how you would have to write this is what happens with a vacancy, which I don't understand. I mean, I know Commissioner Kelly served the term, and he served a 4-year term on a vacancy. So what happens if somebody gets elected to a 4-year term and resigns?
Right.
How is that filled?
Yeah, and so I
Right.
believe whether it's under statute or our charter, I'd have to look at which. How it happens now is the members of the same party nominate somebody to fill the vacancy.
Correct.
Correct.
For 4 years?
No,
so-
to finish the term.
Finish the
For the
term.
remainder of the
term.
term.
Right.
So somebody gets, you think about this. So somebody could get elected, not serve 1 day, right? And then 3 people pick that person for 4 years. I'm not sure that's, you know,
Yeah, that's it.
I don't like that.
That's the worst case scenario.
Right.
Right,
I
right.
mean, this is
My feeling is the public should pick.
it's
So-
it's why I'm, but Gary, the things you're talking about are why I'm biased for 2 years, right? Or you nominate somebody and they turn out to be a maniac, right? In some way that the voters didn't understand, right? Much easier to get rid of them after 2 years than they're there for 4.
Right.
But I get the consistency point, right? I get the consistency that if planning and zoning has to be 4, why not have the Board of Ed for? Like, this is where I see both sides all too well on this one.
Well, then you would have to we would have to put in the charter that if someone were to fill it, it would be until the next election.
Right.
And yeah, and my question is that a charter thing or a statute thing? When it comes
We
to-
would put that's what we would put in the charter, that any vacancies goes to the next election.
That throws off the whole rotation though, Gary.
Well,
then
no,
you're-
then we'd have to figure that out. I mean, if you think about it, if the mayor were to if something happened to the mayor the day after, right? I mean, it goes to the next election,
Goes to the-
same,
Right.
Yeah.
Well, no, it goes to the president of the Board of Aldermen to serve out the term,
to
right?
serve out the term. So it goes to the next election.
You would have the vacancy thing, if you wanted to have it as an election, and first we have to make sure that that's allowed, is it would be a special election for that seat, right? So you would have, let's say.
At the next municipal election, excuse me.
Right. Yeah, of course. So you would have, let's say you'd have an election for 5 of the seats, right? And this is one of the other 4 seats that has an opening. You're going to elect 5, and then you're going to select 1, right, to fill that remaining term.
To fill that remaining term.
The remaining term, right.
So the question again becomes, do we want 2 or 4?
But again, I think it goes back to the fact that we need a legal opinion on this because we're just spinning our wheels. We really are. We're spinning our wheels. We don't know whether we are justifiably, if we can go to a 7 and have 2-year terms. So we're going to go through all this exercise and then find out that we can't do it or that we
Well,
can.
Art-
So
Well, the decision would be if we decided to go 4, then we probably don't need a legal opinion.
I guess we got to figure out what our preference would be. A
Correct.
unanimous preference.
Correct. That's what I'm saying. Is that I like if we like I honestly didn't know where you guys were going to come out on this. Like if everyone was like, yeah, we want 2, then I'd say, yeah, let's go get the legal opinion. Maybe we go with the Supreme Court case and say, look, this is a case of home rule. But if people are divided on it, right, or if we're kind of like, right, it's a question of is that the path we want to go down?
I just believe there was a legal decision rendered after the last charter because it's not in the last charter. So a legal decision was rendered after that charter was adopted that said that we had to have staggered terms for 4 years.
But yeah, but my argument is if we had a legal opinion, this is a Supreme Court decision. That's not a legal opinion.
Okay, well, now we need a legal opinion on top of that to determine whether that applies to us, right?
Well,
I don't know. I mean,
and
no.
this is where I'm going to solve the chicken and the egg, right? Which is, there's legal opinion in what we want, right? What we're allowed to do and what we want to do. I personally don't want to go down the legal opinion quagmire path, right? Because the stuff Gary is laying out very gray areas, right? We're walking into very gray areas there. I'm willing to walk there if that's where everyone wants to go, but I don't want to start going there unless everybody says, yeah, that's where we want to go.
Well, can we get the decision that was rendered upon planning and zoning at that time? Why we made that switch?
It's
got to be on record.
It's probably, yeah, you'd have to go back to their minutes, but it was they probably pulled out this statute. And this statute was written, I don't know when, you have to go back. It looks like it says 1959. Right? But the Supreme Court case was done last year. And I think that's, that could change, things if we chose to. If our feeling is to go 4 years, then I think the 2-year question is moot.
Let me just ask you a question because I'm a little confused at this point. If we're talking about going to a 7-member commission, right?
Correct.
Correct.
Okay. And this says that you could have 4, no more than 4 terms on a 7 or 8-member commission.
Yep.
Expiring. So what's the issue, even under the terms of this?
It means that you can only elect 4 in any 1 year.
Right.
Right.
So you can have your staggered.
You could have your staggered terms, but then you're electing them every year, right? So you'd have 4 elected in 2020, 3 elected in 2021, 4 elected in 2022, right? So if you want a 2-year term, you need to.
No, I'm talking 4-year term.
Oh, 4-year. Yeah.
7-member commission.
Yeah.
2-year staggered.
Yeah. Right.
The debate is going back to a 2-year term.
Right.
That's the debate.
That's right. 4-year.
Wanting to
Oh,
go
I
back.
see. Okay.
4-year terms, no problem, right? So that's my question. Is like I see what you guys see, right? Is that what's good for the goose is good for the gander in terms of planning and zoning and Board of Ed, right? If there's an argument for a 4-year term, there's a good argument for both, right? If there's an argument for a 2-year term, there's a good argument for both. And so if you guys all said, hey, 4-year term is what we want, then great. We don't have to do any legal opinions or go into the gray area. That's clearly allowed. If everyone said, no, I want both of those to be 2-year terms, again, no problem for Board of Ed. That's how it is now. But then we have to figure this out. Is that allowed under this language? Or do we want to go into that gray area that hasn't been tested yet of that Supreme Court case?
Right. And if the group decides to go 4 years, I would just like to make sure that we write how the vacancy.
I agree with that.
And that wouldn't be probably, at this part, that would probably be a different part of the chart on vacancies.
Yep.
Across the board, not just P and Z, right?
Yeah, across the board.
Yeah. Anything that's a 4-year term.
Yeah.
Right, for a 2-year term, yeah, it's fine till the next election.
Till the next election.
Right, the 4-year term you'd want to fill.
Does that include library board?
It would. We want to be consistent.
Yeah, my feeling is whether we would make the library board consistent with what we're doing here also.
Correct. Yes, there is a certain symmetry of making them all 4-year boards, because library board is 6 right now.
Correct.
I'm for that too.
I'd agree.
And, one of the other things we debated on is the alternates, and I did, albeit very late today before the meeting, I went online to kind of determine how many other planning and zoning commissions have alternate members. And the size that we're proposing, the size that we are, many do have alternate members. Some have 3 alternate members. And I think the reason we were debating eliminating them was because they're more of an appointed position. Each party puts up one. One of the things, if you look through the record, you see how many times, maybe a third of the meetings, alternates are called. One of the nuances that we have is that either any alternate can stand in for either party. So if it's a Democratic appointment or elected official, but appointed, they could sit in for a Republican if the Republican alternate is not present. So we don't differentiate that in our charter. But if we are going to go with the parties, I would definitely recommend that we do that.
Up there, you're bouncing in and out.
Ruth, I'm sorry. My phone rang and my computer went off. I didn't really hear what you were saying. Sorry.
So with the alternates, the current way our alternates work in Shelton is that there's one from each party. And if a Republican is absent and the Republican alternate is not present, then the Democratic alternate can sit in for the Republican. So they sit in for wherever there's a vacancy.
I think, an alternate, I think an alternate's needed. I think if there's a conflict of interest, somebody should be able to excuse themselves. And that's probably the purpose of an alternate, because we're allowing, there shouldn't be a lot of times people can't make the meetings, because we allow it remotely if we decide to do that. And
there's a bigger problem if there's somebody's absent a lot.
Right, if there's somebody's absent. But if, but somebody says, well, there's a conflict of interest here, I would like to be excused, then the alternate comes in. And but I think if we should elect 7 the way we're talking and have 1 alternate elected. So both parties put up a person, and whoever wins becomes the alternate on the board. So we would still have the 8 people we presently have. Right now we have 6 plus 2. I would personally like to see 7 plus 1.
Plus 1.
So it would be the alternate with the highest vote?
Yes.
Independent, Democrat, or Republican?
Correct.
Okay, so we've kind of shifted topics.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So are you guys interested? So we had the decision, right? And again, it was not speak now, forever hold your peace. But the decision we had when we talked about planning was 7, no alternates, right? With the theory being, I think to what Gary said, is that if we are going to allow for people to vote remotely, which I think we are, then there's not as much need for an alternate. What I hear you guys saying now is maybe there is a need for an alternate because of conflicts. Is that it? Because there might be a conflict of interest? Or...
Conflict of interest.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so have one alternate who is truly elected, right? Highest vote getter gets to be the alternate. What are folks what's folks' reaction to that?
I like the idea of 1 alternate. We received, I don't know if everybody got this, but we did receive a breakout. In 2018, 6 out of 20 meetings. In 2019, 8 out of 23 meetings. In 2020 so far, 4 out of 6 meetings. So the alternates have been useful.
I don't feel strongly one way or the other. I'm comfortable with it if that's where everybody wants to go.
Why don't we just elect 8 then? What's the motivation for an alternate versus? a first?
There's the odd number again.
Oh, I see. So the option is to have 7-1 default to 6 if you've got a conflict, or 7 default to 6, or 7 and an alternate and default to 7.
Right. You default to, you don't really default to a lower number.
Right.
Well, you do if someone's absent. Well, no, you don't if someone's absent.
Yeah, so
If 2 people are absent, you do.
the world we're picturing, right? So the world we're picturing is there is 7 planning and zoning members. They can vote remotely, so absence shouldn't be an issue. But in the event that someone has a conflict of interest and has to recuse themselves, you still want 7 votes. So now you have this alternate who can step in and be that 7th vote.
Correct.
I like that idea.
It makes sense to me.
Yeah.
I like that too.
Well,
Makes sense.
So we will reintroduce an alternate on, let me write this down, make sure I get it. We are one alternate for P and Z. Okay, I'll add that into our P and Z section later.
That
But-
alternate would serve a 2-year term, however,
Why?
correct?
I would have them serve concurrently with the P and Z. I would have them, if it's a 4-year term, I would have to be a 4-year term for the alternate. Why would we make it different?
right.
Most alternates are in other towns, just for a matter of point.
Yep. What's the logic though, Ruth? Like what would be the logic of saying we want that one to be 2 years, but the permanent members to be 4?
And I see your
I
point.
have no response.
Yeah.
The first year, we would have to adjust things. But going into the second municipal election, then that's how it would be. And that alternate would be running just like everybody else. So everybody be basically running for a 4-year term.
Right.
Except the first election.
Right. So do people want 2-year? Well, so let's go with the term. We'll figure out the term with the other terms. So let's go back to that. Are people thinking, so, we do want an alternate. The question of 4-year versus 2-year terms, how do people want to handle that? The easy route, quite honestly, is so I'm laying out the easy route. The easy route is to say 4-year terms for Board of Ed, P and Z, and Library Board. Now, if that's the right answer, but it's the easy answer, because it says that there's no legal ambiguity about it. Most boards of education in other towns are 4 years. P and Z is already 4 years for us. And Library Board, I think it just makes it consistent. I don't think anybody's going to have a problem with going from 6 to 4. So that's the easy one. I don't know if that's right, though. What do people think?
Well, I had a thought, we had discussion early on about getting people to run for these boards. They are the most comprehensive boards, the Board of Ed and the Planning and Zoning Board. If we're having trouble getting people to come up and volunteer for this, now we're going to double the time commitment on their part. Are we going to really get those qualified, good people like Don talked about? This may be putting a lot of burden on people that people can't give. We talked about that early on when we first met.
And I say this, I'm biased towards a 2-year term as well. I actually think a 4-year term may be more attractive in terms of recruiting people because you don't have to run as much. I think most people hate running.
Well, hello, yes, that's it's a timely, costly event and it disrupts your entire family. But nevertheless, there are so many subcommittee meetings for these 2 boards that it's not It's not something that you can do easily. Sometimes there's 40 hours a week. You know, if you're doing your job on the Board of Ed and you're attending functions during the day, going to all the meetings in the evenings, all the special meetings, the executive meetings, you're putting in anywhere between 30 and 40 hours a week. And that's not including expulsions, suspensions, or any other on a surprising event of, you know, whatever affair that can happen. So I just think to ask somebody to give 4 years, if they want to go run again, let them run again, and the voting people will vote for them or not. But to ask for 4 years for the Board of Ed is a humongous commitment. And right now, things are in such crazy realms that we don't, you know, a lot of people don't know what's happening. So, I mean, we don't even know if school will continue this year or not. I think probably not. But now we have to rethink schools for September. And California is already coming up with a 3-choice plan to address this because they are anticipating another wave of COVID. So
let's do this, guys. So
I think 2 years is enough for anyone to commit to for their family. We want young people, you know, family members to join, and they have young children. Can you really be away that much? You know, I mean, it's a lot for everybody, retired or whatever, but it's a lot of time.
I think, and I'll commend people that put their names up and run and serve, and they put a lot of time in. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I do believe, I haven't made up my mind either way, that if you have 4-year terms, you're basically recruiting less people every year. So it may be easier to find people because you have less numbers to go find. You know, it's kind of hard if if you're the minority party, it's hard to go find extra people to run. I think most of our folks in town have, there has been a lot of retirees. They get elected and they like it and they serve. And,
it becomes a passion. I think Darlissa raises some very valid points, but I think the people that run have a real passion for what they're running for. And the 4-year terms allows them to give it their undivided attention and not have to worry about re-election every 2 years.
On a particular whim, because sometimes, you know, when you're a public official, Dan, I think you'll agree with this, you got to make some tough calls. And when you're running every 2 years, it becomes a little bit harder, I guess, you know, to maybe making the right decision versus the popular decision.
There's strong arguments on both ways.
Yep.
There really are.
There is no right answer here, guys, right? And you can see it in, you know, other towns have it all over the place, right? So I think that the question for us is, do we want to decide this tonight, right? Because the other one I'm going to show you is the appointed boards, right? So again, I think there is an easy decision around 4 years. Whether that's the right decision or not, I don't know. Like if I could wave a magic wand, like, and there's no legal issues or anything, I'm kind of with Darlissa on the 2 years. But given the legal difficulties we have potentially around P&Z being 2 years, and given the fact that most other Board of Eds are 4 years, I see that argument too, right? I know I'm being super wishy-washy on this, right? But I see them both. Let me throw one more thing into the mix before we talk, which is these appointed boards, right? So the appointed boards that we have in Shelton are also all over the place right now, but in a narrow range. So the boards that are appointed in sections 5.2 and 5.3 of the charter range between 3 and 5 years, right? And with the exception of Board of Assessment Appeals, which maybe it mentions a state statute in charter, I've not looked that up yet. don't quite see a logic to why 3 or 4 or 5 here. It's not like some of them are, 8 years because we really need somebody to be there for a long time. So again, there's a beauty of simplicity argument that you say you make everything 4, right? 4 is the average, 4 is kind of like the middle of 3 to 5. You can get everything on the same schedule going for the city. There's a simplicity to it. But again, that's easy. I don't know if that's right.
Well,
I think Alyssa had a good argument about, the 2 years of getting people to commit. But I think if you went to 4 years, you might find that you're going to have people that are the people that are going to run are going to be people that are willing to commit to those 4 years. And that might be a positive thing.
Well, I can speak to that a little bit because I was new on the board, and so I've worked with other new people, and current people who are new to the board, they are flabbergasted at how much time it takes, and they're looking to get off. They want to get their 2 years done and they're gone. Because I can't imagine them thinking to go 4 years. I think we'll have too much turnover. I think it could be worse.
But would you
Maybe
attract
we
people
need
with
to
different
think about, maybe we need to think about leaving 2 years at the Board of Ed, and maybe we need to leave P and Z as it is. Maybe though the plans we have might be the best way.
Yeah, but doesn't planning and zoning have, don't they have as much time constraints for them as well? Commitments?
Well, they both are extremely
Yeah.
comprehensive.
So why does that argument fall for
There's
this
not as many committees.
in planning and zoning?
Yeah, there's not as many
Oh,
committees
okay.
on planning and zoning.
I think
And the Board of Ed has a lot of events during the workday.
the backup to Darlissa's argument, right? Like, so I'm gonna swim in Darlissa's argument for a second because part of it really makes sense to me, which is, again, if I could wave a magic wand and you force me to decide, I'd make everything 2 years. But it can't be because of that statute. So P&Z is 4 years. So it ain't consistent, but I've optimized for something that's important to me, which is responsiveness to the people, right? We had this debate for the mayor. We all said 2 years. I don't think anybody would put the alderman to 4 years, right? We want those bodies to be responsive to the people. And so we could adopt one of different, there are a couple different principles here, right? One principle is consistency. And if you're going to be consistent, the easiest place to be consistent is 4 years. You could also say, we want to maximize responsiveness to the voters as much as statute will allow, which is kind of where we are today with Board of Ed and Planning and Zoning. And we could talk about the appointed boards. There are many, many ways to skin this.
I think you could probably argue that a longer term is more responsive to voters. Building on Gary's point. In other words, people aren't pushed to make, expeditious decisions. I mean, they can make good decisions. And I think also that we might be approaching the argument, you can approach it from another way, and you want committed people. You want more serious people. You want to change the paradigm a little bit here. You want something a little more robust than we have.
Yep.
And I think that you get that when people can kind of, put their anchor down and dig in.
Yeah.
A lot of people on committees in this town put in hours that are unbelievable.
Yes.
Whether it's the Conservation Commission, we've built schools where we've had guys go full-time for 3 months on the project, full-time. So, I mean, and they've lasted for 3 or 4 years. So, I mean, I think you want committed people. And,
You make a strong argument, Don. And
Absolutely.
you look at, this is where I'm arguing out both sides of my mouth on this. I should have been a lawyer. Is you look at the argument you're making, Don, is the same argument for the United States Senate and why the founders made the Senate 6 years, right? Was because you wanted people who didn't have to worry about the next election, who could be thinking long term, who could be making decisions. So, I mean, I see that point as well.
So maybe one of the things to address the Board of Ed is to just add additional members. If it's so taxing for the existing members, add to the board so that there's more shared responsibility. What do you think about that, Darlissa?
Well, that's why, the idea of ward representation was brought up, I think. But I keep thinking about Bridgeport in the troubles they had year after year after year on their Board of Ed. They couldn't get rid of people. Education stopped. They had so many superintendents coming and going because the board had one or two very contentious people. They had to be escorted out by police. Nothing ever got done for that period of time. And they were
Right.
stuck with those people for 4 years. I just, I'm not a soothsayer. I have no idea what the future is going to be, but I could see that happening anywhere because parents on the Board of Ed want their child's school to have everything. They want their child's needs met, and sometimes that clouds the waters, and if you get somebody who is on and they're thinking their child for every decision they're making, then you have 4 years. Whereas at the P&Z, it's a project. I don't know very much about P&Z, but you have more regulations to go by. And the Board of Ed, even though we have a huge policy book, there's a lot of open discretion, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, let me pause you
But
there.
I think that, you gotta, it's a different can of worms. We're talking about children's lives. 4 years of the same person making the decision who may not understand education. That's 4 years of a child's life that could be messed up, and they never get that time back again.
Let me pause there, right? Because we're coming up on an hour talking about this.
Okay.
Kind of just under our way of being right now, it is, hey, if something's unanimous, then we move forward, and if it's not, we don't. Just from hearing you guys talk about this now, we're not unanimous, right? That we're not in a place where we have unanimity. I'm hearing a lot of passion from Darlissa on 2 years for the Board of Ed, hearing a lot of passion from Don on 4 years. I'm hearing most of the rest of us, I'm bouncing back and forth, right? So I think we pause this one for now and take it up again. I mean, there may be issues where we got to vote eventually, where we're not unanimous, but like on this one, I say we punt for now and revisit it next week and see upon further reflection where we are. And I think in the meantime, Ruth, the thing that I can do is just poke around on that, on what happened in 2013. So if we have any more insight into, what happened after the last charter was passed that forced us to 4-year terms, more data.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it had more to do with the election cycle than it did the board because it wasn't by regulation. So yeah, I'm not sure where you would find that information, but I think we just all personally need to come to some sort of consensus as to, I chaired the board when it was 2 years. I chaired it when it was 4. To me, there was not much of a difference. We had good board members all around. We didn't have the issues that Darlissa said. If you're stuck with somebody for 4 years, we didn't have that, but the potential is certainly there. I think we're talking about uniformity, right? So we're looking for whatever decision we make to be uniform for both the Board of Ed and Planning and Zoning. So I would just recommend that members just really think about where their preference would be, and that's the direction we should take, right?
Yeah, and let's everybody, we've had a good discussion about this. Let's everybody reflect on it. Let's return to it next week. And if we're still not all in agreement, we might be in a place where we need to vote. But let's all reflect on it. I know I'm going to. Anything else on this topic you guys wanted to talk about? Any reaction on the appointed boards? Like, do you guys feel like, yeah, we want to standardize these appointed boards as well? Or, hey, it's okay as it is. It's not that much of a variation. What do people think about these appointed boards?
I think if we're going for uniformity, it should be across all of them.
I agree. Standardize it.
I feel the same.
Okay, so if that's where we end up, that's where we'll end up with these guys as well. Unless, again, asterisk, unless there's something in state statute that says Board of Assessment
Prohibits it.
3 years. Okay, so a very good discussion, but no resolution on these tonight. All right, that was the hardest one.
Good.
All right, let me scroll down here, my computer. All right, so next one was on the budget. And so we had the question of increasing the amount the purchasing agent must have before they go out to bid. And one of the things that I was looking at, and so I did we asked, let's finish the comparable analysis. So I finished it. Let me share this with you. And I went down a bit of a rabbit hole on it, not a very deep rabbit hole, but basically, the purchasing, the vast majority of purchasing levels, as you can see here, are not mentioned in the charter at all. They're done by ordinance or just not mentioned. And I was like, there's a whole bunch of these charters where it just isn't even mentioned, right? The purchasing isn't mentioned. And the other thing I noticed was that the maximum that these towns that did mention it have was the bid level had to be $25,000 or more, and everything else was less. So I actually did some digging and looking in state statutes and found, let me again share back in Word, found the state statute that actually refers to this. And so it's actually Title 7, Chapter 96, or 98, Section 7, 148V. Basically, it says that the towns can actually do what they want, right? Notwithstanding the provisions of any municipal charter or any special act to the contrary, anybody can, by ordinance, establish minimum requirements for competitive bidding. As long as, except otherwise pronounced, at 25,000, you got to go to bid. Right, so basically state statute says you could do less, but $25,000 is where you have to go out and get bids. And what we saw is in practice, some towns put in their charter a lesser amount than 25,000. In some cases, they also put in the, hey, go out and get 3 quotes. But a lot of towns said, leave that up to to the ordinance. So how does that tie into what we were talking about? Well, we actually last time had said, the idea we left off with was, let's set a level to go out to bid in charter and leave other levels like what to get 3 quotes to the Board of Aldermen. Actually, where we ended up turns out what most other towns do, right? They either default to the 25,000, which, by the way, was what the purchasing agent recommended, was 25,000 to go out to bid, and leave everything else to the Board of Aldermen. If they want to establish another level to get 3 quotes, they can do that. So that's kind of what I'm proposing to you guys tonight, is we actually raise that amount for it to go out to bid to that 25,000 level, which is what most towns do, what's in state statute, and what the purchasing agent recommended. And then allow the Board of Aldermen to establish a second tier for 3 quotes if they see fit. What do you guys think of that?
I
I
agree.
think that's a good idea.
I think that works.
Mhm.
Told you this one would be easier. Based on where we came out last time. So we're saying 25,000 to go out to bid charter, with BOA able to establish other lesser levels for 3 quotes. Right? Anybody object to that or have a problem with that?
Good.
Okay.
I'm okay.
Good. Next one then is 2% the right level to trigger a referendum to approve bonding? And where we had come out last time is we were talking about, yes, we wanted to raise it. The question was, do we want to either raise it to 3% with a majority vote or up to 4% with a 2/3 vote, or maybe tier it. And we said, okay, let's see what other towns do. Unfortunately, looking at other towns for this one was not as helpful. Because the truth is that very few other towns have this dual system that the legislative body can do up to a certain amount, and then it goes to referendum. Like the closest is somebody like Danbury, where they established 3 million, which is what about 3% would be. And then beyond that, it goes to referendum. But the city council can approve anything under 3 million with a 2/3 vote.
Dan, are they cumulative
Cumulative.
or per item?
Cumulative for Dan.
Oh, okay.
That's cumulative. Now, for other towns, you'll see most other towns don't have a trigger. It's either all bonding has to go to a town meeting or a referendum, or there's no referendum. Like in Bridgeport, they could do as much as they want, the city council. In Stamford, they can do as much as they want. You tend to see in the bigger cities that they can do as much as they want, right? And there are very few towns, other towns with this trigger, right? Some have, like, again, Ridgefield has over 3 million goes to referendum, but otherwise the town meeting, which is their legislative body, can approve that. Some, like, interesting, like in Trumbull, you need a 2/3 vote of town council and board of finance to avoid referendum on any amount, but otherwise it goes to referendum. So just, we have an interesting system that, no other town I found does it like we do. But having said that, I like how we do it. Having said that, I actually think there's a logic, and I think Alderman Anglis laid out the logic that you actually create a check and a balance on this capital spending, that you allow for kind of what you need to run the city, and everything else you're going to want voter approval for. Right? Because you're obviously, you are committing future tax dollars and basically building in future tax increases by bonding something for a long period of time. So having said all that, I don't have the answer, but just wanted to give you guys the information to see where you wanted to come out, whether people felt 3% and a majority, 4% and 2/3, both, neither, and we wanted to head in a different direction. I just open the floor to you guys.
And we're saying all bonding. Does that mean borrowing also?
It means bonding. There's borrowing. Authorization for short-term borrowing is different in most towns. But that borrowing level is typically fixed at some amount. Like I think in Westport, it was like $500,000 that they could borrow. But it was usually for a term of like a year or less, right? It was like, you need to borrow for cash flow needs.
Right, but we, I guess our town went out and borrowed this year instead of bonding, and we all thought it was a pretty good idea, which I do, because it didn't trigger all the expenses that go along with bonding. Where we were able to go to a bank and borrow, I don't remember what the actual number was, and we didn't incur the $100,000 in legal fees.
Correct.
So I think when we word what we're doing, we've got to put all borrowing, because and then somebody can make the decision, or the board of aldermen make the decision whether they want to bond it or go to a bank and borrow it.
Well, and this is where this is where other towns do this, and we are allowed to do this, Garrett. You could separate out borrowing for cash flow needs, which is typically short term, versus capital improvements. Right. And you could basically say, hey, look, if you need to borrow, right, the town needs to borrow for 2 years or less, the Board of Aldermen can do that without limitation. Right.
Well, what about 5 years? I mean, if you were going to, you needed, and I don't know what a fire truck costs, $800,000 for a fire truck, and we're going to pay it off in 5 years. Do we have to go out and bond for that? Or can we just go out and borrow?
The town has done a lot of 5-year borrowing.
Yeah.
Very effectively for many years. Okay, so I guess and I was a little confused in the presentation, because it sounded like the borrowing somehow, based on either ordinance or the way they do it, falls within a certain aggregate limit that they impose upon themselves. Okay. you know, if we can draw this distinction, you know, between the warrants or the short 5-year financing versus what is bonding, I like the idea of the 3 million with a majority, the 4 million with a super majority, and default to a referendum, because you have to have a default if it's an emergency, right? You can't have people.
Waiting around.
Yeah, but if we were gonna build a school or build a new firehouse or some, you know, big structure, we would go out for a vote and you'd bond. And you'd probably do it over 5 years. I don't know, 10 years or whatever else. I don't know what the actual 20 years, yeah. Long-term borrowing, you know, like a mortgage on a house. And short-term capital needs, why go out and incur the bonding costs? So you go to a bank, and if you're paying it off under 5 years, I mean, you know, people borrow, you know, pay off a car in 5 years.
I think it'd be interesting to draw that distinction, to dig in, figure out how it works, separate it and say, you know, because again, Shelton has been doing this for years.
Yeah, and our debt is very little for the size community we have.
So would people want then, would you, just to make sure I'm understanding the conversation, would we want then to have for all borrowing, whether it's bonded or not, right? Whether you bond or borrow from a bank, that's an administrative decision. But
Correct.
the cap that you're talking about is 3% with a majority, or if you wanted to go up to 4%, you can do that with a 2/3 vote. Beyond that, for any borrowing, no matter how you term it, but whether it's bonding, you're going to a bank, whatever, you got to go to referendum.
That's how I could buy that.
What are the?
I don't, okay. You're saying that in aggregate, for instance, if borrowing, whether it's bond, short-term, exceeds $4 million. Okay. So if you've got this incremental, if you got you're building this over time, and say you're at 3.75 million, and then along comes that $500,000 investment that you want to.
It's per year, Don.
Yeah.
I realize that. But I guess I see the value of separating out short-term borrowing if ordinance will allow it and if parties will allow it, because again, it's not really a, you know, it's not a long-term commitment.
And it does, Don.
It's just.
To your point, I laid out something that I thought I understood you guys were saying. You could also separate them. You could all we could do almost anything we want here, as you can see the range of powers that the legislative body has in the competitive in the other town analysis. Is we could say that, hey, the Board of Aldermen, when it comes to short-term borrowing, defined as 5 years or less, can borrow as much as they want.
Yeah. So.
Right.
I'm not sure that's a great idea, and that's what John was saying. That you know, he's afraid that that's what they would do. So theoretically, they can come in every month for $1 million, and we're borrowing $12 million that year in short term. Right. And just keep on doing that.
That's my worry as well, Gary.
That's my worry.
Yeah.
So that's why I think you got to have a cap.
Right.
And that's why I don't mind a high cap either. Right? Like I don't mind, especially like the reason I like the tiered approach that you know Trumbull used as well is that, hey, if you want to get a big number, I'm okay with even saying rather than 4%, 5% with a 2/3 vote, right? With a super majority, if there's a real need in town and everybody agrees on it and we have unanimity, then okay, go ahead and do it, right? And not for a $20 million school. We're all saying that goes to referendum. But if there's short-term borrowing needs, whether they're going to bond it or whether they're going to borrow it from a bank, I do want to give our Board of Aldermen flexibility to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying is, for a simple majority of the board, they can go up to 3%. Correct. Which is about $3 million a year.
A little bit over. Yeah.
A little bit over. If they were to go beyond that to, let's say, up to 4 or 5%. Then to go over that 3 million during that year, then they would need a super majority of 2/3 of the board to go from that part.
Correct.
Anything over that $4 or $5 million, then it needs to go to referendum.
Yep. Yes. I'll put a stake in the ground, even though I could be convinced otherwise. I'll put a stake in the ground and say, I like that.
Yeah, I like it as well. I just want to understand how they're doing it now.
Yeah.
Because
I like it too.
I really didn't understand his explanation when he was in.
They're up to 2%, up to 2% they could do that. So
Up
we're
to 2% aggregate borrowing. So they're working their way through the fiscal year. They're in month 8
Right.
and they're at 1.9 million.
then we can't do anything.
Then they gotta wait. They gotta,
Then they gotta wait. We need another whatever,
Or go out to referendum.
$150,000.
and I guess my only point is, if that's the way they're doing it, and I'm not 100% sure of that, but Gary, you may know that for a fact, then it might make sense to break out some of the borrowing, whether it's cash flow stuff, whether it's, a land acquisition, a land contract or something that is manageable, identifiable, again, I agree 100% with that, the whole idea of doing that. I really would like to understand what they're doing now, but again, I agree.
Danny, do you think it should be, what do you think? Danny? Out bonding for special purposes?
What does that mean?
I don't know.
Yeah,
What-
did they talk about purpose on kindness 101?
Oh,
Yeah,
yeah?
I don't think they know what kindness 101 is.
Okay, buddy, let's go upstairs, go watch Kindness.
The next class in service,
Exactly.
you can find purpose in service.
Oh, that's great.
And you need to watch it next Monday.
We will watch that next Monday, buddy. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Okay. All right. Good night, buddy. Yes, he's watching Kindness 101, and tonight was about purpose through service. So a good.
Perfect
Timely.
example.
So a good theme for tonight. But but you were saying, Don, I'm sorry, I got distracted.
No, I'm just, what I'm saying is I agree that, 3% majority, 4% supermajority default. The only exception is it might be worthwhile to understand how they handle the other borrowing and somehow break some of that out of that limit.
Of the bonding.
And I don't think that really flies in the face with what John was saying. I just didn't think John liked the bigger numbers on the top.
Right. So I think, Dan, I think we have consensus here. It's how we write it.
Right. That's right. How much flexibility you write into it.
Right.
Yes.
And Don, how would you, I just want to probe, how would you see that as we write version 1 of this? How might you carve that out, right? If the overall limit, you say, look, overall, it's either 3% with a majority or 4% with 2/3 vote. Anything over that goes to referendum. What other flexibility could you see building in there? And you don't have to answer now if you want to think about it.
No, I just think that, again, it's just a question of going to them, going to the finance director. I can't remember his name.
Paul Heller.
Yeah, go to Paul, go to Mark, and just discuss the kinds of borrowing they're doing and whether or not there are elements of that simply should be broken out. Short-term, flexible, again, just giving them more flexibility, without creating any real liability. And I didn't fully understand Paul's discussion of that. So
Yeah, let me take it back to him. Let me take it back to him to ask him and see if there's if there is something more flexibility that he could see us needing. Good.
Yeah, they borrow, in
That's
other
a
words,
good idea.
the city borrows, the city is borrowing constantly for cash flow. Of course, that's out of the mix. But then the city has very effectively acquired land over short-term agreements with owners. That's not really an exposure for the town. That's, a 3-4 year land contract. I don't know. I don't think
Isn't that
that's
typically done through a open space though?
Is it done through open space?
Yeah, isn't there an ordinance on open space that funding is driven through?
No, I think there's been a couple farms that came through and the town has bought them over a 3 or 4 year period.
There've been,
And I don't know if they bought that through their automatic bonding or not, or just through, you know.
Like the tall firm, yeah. I don't know.
but I just think those short-term investments shouldn't really encumber the town from going forward and saving those bonding fees.
Yeah.
You know, so anyway.
No, there may be you know, separate from this, there may be a second short-term bonding limit that doesn't count towards that cap. That we say there's another cap that you can short-term bond up to X, right? Whatever X is, $2 million. As long as that's not more than X years of, you know, of term, then you can do that once a year. That you have a separate cap that you have once a year. So to John's point, it's not unlimited. You can do that unlimited short-term borrowing for those things, but it doesn't count towards that cap that triggers a referendum. I could see that. Let me talk to Paul about that and see if that's, you know, see like that. My question to him is gonna be, how often does that come up, right? If that's like oh yeah, every year we're struggling, right? Because we gotta fit everything under this cap, and there's this other stuff we'd love to do. Then I think that makes a lot of sense. If he says, don't need that flexibility, then okay, maybe we still build it in anyway, but it's not as compelling. All right, so we accept that overall idea with the to-do to ask Paul if there's more flexibility needed.
Good night, honey.
All right.
Good night.
We get all the kids right around 8.
Exactly. 8:30.
All right. Next idea was a state of emergency clause, right? And you know, the question here was, is this necessary, and what do other towns do? So I looked, and there apparently, and I didn't find it. Apparently there are powers that are bestowed by state statute, that municipal CEOs do have some powers. Then the charter, they're allowed by charter to get extra powers. So I'm just, and not many charters have these emergency power things, but basically you can see here, the ones that I did find is Monroe has one that says that the town council is empowered to pass emergency measures that require they require no public hearing, right? So unlike most ordinances that require a public hearing, we don't need one. But then that ordinance terminates after 61 days, right? Newtown basically says that the first selectman can do almost anything they want, right, for 5 days, right? So they can put out a resolution in an emergency, and the declaration shall be effective for a minimum amount of time not to exceed 5 days. After those 5 days, the legislative council has to vote on it, or the thing doesn't take it, the thing goes away. But it's very vague in terms of what that could be. Oxford actually says, okay, if there's an emergency exists, then basically the same thing, but with only 48 hours, right? So basically, again, the first selectman can declare a state of emergency and can basically do what he needs to do in the best interest of the town for 48 hours. But after that, the Board of Selectmen has to ratify what he says, or it goes away. Stanford basically says, this is where I was like, okay, it's in state statute. Stanford, they basically say, hey, he can do whatever he's allowed to do under state statutes. So my question on this one is, do we think this is necessary, right? The mayor already does have powers under state statute. I don't know what they are, but I also see that other towns give their first selectmen temporary extreme power to, result in an emergency, right? There's a flood and you need to tell everybody to get out. Mayor's allowed to say you must evacuate. You have no choice. But that's only true for 48 hours or 5 days in the case of these charters. What letter is this? What do you guys think?
I like what Oxford had to say. The paragraphs there.
Yep.
With a limit the 48 hours.
48 hours really restricts it to some sort of weather event, I would think, right?
Probably.
Yeah.
The thing I haven't gotten a chance to do this, we had also down to ask the mayor if he thought he needed this power. So we didn't really bring this up with him. I've not gotten a chance to ask him that yet.
Well,
Yeah.
this would be a good time to ask them.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess everything's working today. I mean, you know, between the governor's, you know, executive powers and allowing mayors to do certain things. You know, they've given the mayor certain powers and our aldermen. So maybe the state process is working.
Right, the state statutes.
The vast
The only
majority.
question-
don't have this.
The only question I have is, what if there is an event that is not covered by state statute? You know, we're living in some uncharted territory. We're beginning to live in it. And what if there was a complete breakdown of all electronic stuff?
Yeah, then I think that's where, you know, a state would get involved because it would cross kind of municipal lines, right? You know, if a mayor decided to open the school and everybody else was closed, is he allowed to do that? No. So, you know, staying consistent, you know, with the government, you know, at a time like today is probably, you know, kind of pretty good, I guess.
But if
I mean,
there is
I'm all for local control, so.
I'm all for local control too, but I'm just saying that the state statutes may not be pertinent to the occasion. And
Yeah,
then,
if there was a flood or a hurricane or something like that, the mayor, you know, does the mayor tell everybody have to evacuate type of thing?
yeah, could be.
You know, does he need those powers or does he go to the governor to grant them?
Yeah, but in the meantime, while you're waiting for to get hold of the governor, people could be dying.
That I would probably think that you'd get a hold of somebody pretty quickly.
You know, the other thing I could do is, because I don't know, like, and this is my fault for just looking in the charters, I don't know what is allowed under state statute. And like, my opinion would be, if state statute appears to have sufficient power, I don't see a need for this. But if it doesn't, and we're kind of like, oh, that really is kind of weak, right? Like, 'cause I agree with you, Darlis, if there's an emergency and he has to call the governor's office, seems like an extra step we wouldn't need for a local emergency. But if state statute already gives him power akin to what Oxford or Newtown has, and they're just putting it in their charter, I don't know if we need it.
Yeah, it was probably, you know, both of those towns was probably due to some sort of flooding where, you know, like the
Or
old,
like when
like the old
BS blew up.
or like the Maples, you know, when the Maples,
Mhm.
you know, used to flood before they raised those houses.
Right.
You know, maybe the mayor go in there because it's only a, you know, a small number. And that's probably what happened in Oxford or Newtown up north with the river.
Well,
And
and
they
don't
ju-
forget,
just
we
re-
had BF downtown and that had to all be evacuated. You know, with the big fire.
Mm-hmm.
So things do happen, you know.
They
But I
do.
like your idea. Go see what it's, you know, what it says, talk to the
State
mayor and,
statute.
I mean,
and then take it from there.
Those
the question
provisions
of the
already
chart
may be there.
is less better sometimes.
Mhm.
I
Right,
think so.
Yeah.
right.
Agree.
All right, let me do a little more research and come back to you guys with it. All right, another two easy ones. So first is changing the administrative assistant. We said we wanted to change that to something, maybe not chief administrative officer. What do most other towns do? The truth is most other towns don't mention this position in their charter. It's just left up to staff and they can call it whatever they want. The towns that do call it something, all call it something different. Right, so Danbury specifies it as the chief of staff. Stratford specifies it as the chief administrative officer. Weston specifies it as the town administrator. If we're going to keep this position in charter, which I'm absolutely fine doing. I'm actually comfortable with any of those.
You know, is it important that we specify that in the charter? I mean, shouldn't the mayor have a right to organize his office as he sees fit?
Most charters are silent on it.
Mhm.
So, you know, I mean, basically what we're saying here is that if a new mayor came in, he would have to have that person, and that person's duties are X, Y, and Z.
That's what the charter does.
That's what the charter says. I mean, you know, what if he wanted to split that up to 2 people? You know, now is he going against the charter? I think you want to give the chief elected officer some flexibility.
I agree. I don't think it belongs there. And
I do as well. I agree.
the chief administrative officer in Stratford, that was a manager council form of government. So that's probably has morphed from, but he probably plays that role there. But I agree. I don't see the purpose of having that in the charter unless there's something.
You know, I
I
think,
tend to agree too.
Dan, I think what happens is, you know, just like in state statutes, when we pass laws and probably when, you know, this charter started, we add things to it. We don't delete things.
Right.
Could this be in response to the fact that is the mayor's position still technically a part-time position?
No,
It's not, it's a full-time position.
full-time.
Right. And
All right, because it used to be part-time.
right.
Right.
So they made it, you know, full-time. And then when it was part-time and the mayor had to be there, you know, Tuesdays and Thursdays or whatever, they decided to have an administrative assistant.
Right.
And they gave that person all the powers, you know, to run the day-to-day operation. And when you read, you know, the part on administrative assistant, that person does a lot. Now, I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but I think the mayor should have the flexibility of deciding what staff does and what the responsibilities do. I don't think the charter should.
I'm convinced there. You've convinced me. Well, if everyone's okay with that, right? Well, I will actually borrow language from other charters, which literally I saw other charters that had a very, very short sentence that was basically like, the mayor may appoint such staff as is budgeted for his office, right? Like, so the mayor can create his own staff as per the budget. The only person I want to check with this, just because we haven't heard from him, is I just want to talk to Jack, right? Make sure he's comfortable with that.
Yeah, and talk to the mayor.
Yeah. Yep.
Yes, agreed.
Anybody disagree with that one? All right. And then the last one for tonight, which is also, it is the least impactful, but adds a certain something, is the preambles. And so most towns actually don't have preambles. I don't think it necessarily adds anything legal. It is simply flourish. And you can see that, Dan, you can see here, and you can all look at Danbury has one, which I kind of like Danbury's. Newtown has one. I'm not going to read them. You guys can look at them. Weston has one. Right. I kind of liked it. I'm like, has no practical purpose, but I like it.
I think it adds something, you know, to
Go
it.
for it.
Yeah, go ahead, Thomas Jefferson. Were you
Yeah,
doing-
exactly. I'm a founding father of Shelton. All right, I'll write someone as I write something. I'll write something for us to review.
I like the Danbury one as well.
I like
You
the
said.
Danbury one too.
I will use that as a model.
Be creative. Let's be our own. Let's be our own town.
Make sure you put City of Shelton, not.
Not Danbury. No.
But you know, an important part of this, Dan, is the sentence that says, it is our intent to provide a framework for city government. That alludes to home rule.
Mhm.
And I like that sentence. So try to keep that in some form.
I will use Danbury as the example to model on.
Perfect.
Great, gang. So then where we came out tonight is we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 ideas plus an adjustment where we adjusted one of the ideas on adding back in an alternate. So we got more down. We probably have another 13, 14 to go. But we've talked about all of them at this point. So we're just coming down to the wire. Next week, and this is where I want to take the temperature of the commission, is we could start going to a place where we no longer go with unanimity, but if there's disagreements, we start voting. Or we could say, hey, now let's still try to hammer it out and still try to get to unanimity. We're not time-wise at a point where we have to go to voting. It's just a question of whether folks want to keep pressing for unanimous decisions, or if it seems like we disagree, do we vote? I'm fine either way. I just wanted to get the temperature of the room on it, our virtual room.
We're still hammering out the Board of Ed.
I'm thinking
Poor
of,
Board of Ed.
the terms are the one I'm thinking of, right? Because I just don't know if we'll get to consensus on that. But there are other ones as well we might not get to consensus on that we have to go back and look at. So I love consensus. I prefer continuing to drive towards it. I just don't want to go in circles if we're not going to get there.
I think we should
I think we'll get there.
Yeah. All right.
That's my own feeling.
I
Don obviously has a different opinion.
Hey, none of these issues are life or death issues. I think we should just
That's true.
get there and vote.
Yeah, I think we hammer it out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Keep hammering then. All right, gang, I got marching orders for next week for more information on some of these. I will also, again, don't know if I'll get there on a first turn of the actual document by next week, definitely within 2 weeks. So expect to see that. And to Gary's point, I will send that out with enough time for everybody to read it. So we're not reading it in the meeting, right? Like I tend to be sending things out like a couple hours in advance.
Yeah.
On most of this stuff, we've talked about it at least once already. But now as we get into the language, I'll make sure everybody has a couple days to read it before we talk about it.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Anything else, gang, for the good of the order? All right. If not,
No, we're good.
Motion
All right, good job, TJ.
Move to close.
motion to close by Alyssa. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ruth. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Aye.
Aye,
Have
gang.
a good week, everybody.
Next week, guys.
Okay, bye.
Stay well.